Good morning. My name is Jim Van Hecky, and I'm the Director of the Education Outreach section of the North Carolina ABC Commission. And I want to welcome you all today to our third session of this exciting virtual conference, Talk It Out Tuesdays. I want to thank Preston Bumgarner, 919 Marketing, and our entire Talk It Out team for helping put this together and making it happen today. Our objectives are that we want to bring to you great teachers. We want to encourage all of us to be learners rather than learned. Let me share with you a quote by Eric Hoffer to that effect. He said, "In times of change, learners inherit the earth, while the learned find themselves beautifully equipped to deal with a world that no longer exists." Science has taught us so much, and we have progressed in our knowledge of how alcohol affects brain development. And so we want to be learners. We want to continue to learn, and hence we want to share with you some experts in the field. And we're happy. Another objective, is that we want us all to work together. Prevention, treatment, and recovery supports. To that effect, you saw some of the logos across the screen before we began of some of our supporters. It's an impressive list. All of us working together to build collective impact across North Carolina. Prevention, treatment, and recovery supports. We've worked in silos for too long, and it's time for us all to work together. So great teachers, we're going to be learners, and we're going to quit working in silos and begin working together. Our speaker today is a good friend, Dr. Donita Robinson. She's a professor of psychiatry at the Bowles Center for Alcohol Studies at the University of North Carolina. She's also Assistant Dean for Graduate Education in the School of Medicine at Chapel Hill. She has been working in the field of alcohol for some time, and she's going to help us better understand how alcohol affects student success. So with that, I welcome Dr. Donita Robinson. Please mute your audio and welcome her yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be here, and I appreciate the invitation. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And turn on my slides. There we go. Well, thank you, Jim. I really appreciate the invitation, as I said. And I'm going to talk today about alcohol in the teenage brain and how particularly it can impact student success. And at first, before I get started, I wanted to acknowledge people who have helped me develop this presentation, including my lab at UNC and the Greater Bowles Center for Alcohol Studies, as well as some colleagues and the National Institute of Health. So my objective today is to provide information to you that on alcohol neurobiology at a very non-scientific level, so don't be intimidated if you're not a scientist, but information that either you can use when you're making decisions about drinking or that you can use when you're talking to youth about drinking. My first point will be that a little bit about the neurobiology of alcohol drug action, in that it makes you want to drink more. One of the effects of alcohol in the brain is to make you want to continue drinking, and I think it's important to know that. The second point I'm going to make is that the younger brain is different. So the adolescent, young adult brain reacts to alcohol differently, and these developmental differences are important to be aware of. And then the third point that I'm going to make is that binge drinking is an especially harmful pattern of drinking. It can lead to blackouts and other effects that I'll talk about. Okay, so the first point, alcohol makes the brain want to drink. So one very simplistic but effective way to think about the brain is that the brain is designed to learn. You know, it's the organ in our body that helps to keep us alive by our actions. And so if it's thinking about survival, then it's going to be thinking about all of those things that we need to survive and encoding them as rewards. So these would be things like food and water and shelter, affiliation. All of those things are really important for survival of the individual or maybe survival of the species. And so these things are regarded by the brain as rewarding or reinforcing. And also the brain wants to not only be able to recognize and get those things, but it learns all of the context and situations in which it can find those things. The environment that's in the stimuli that are associated with rewards, is learning all about it so that it can recognize when rewards are available in the future. And those brain systems that detect rewards and appreciate rewards are closely linked to those activity systems or locomotor systems that will help us to actually go get the reward. So these are all tied in together. And if we think about the brain, again, this is a very simplistic but effective way to think about it. There's a stop and a go system that I'll show you. But let me orient you first to this picture of the brain. It's a picture of the brain cut down the middle where this is the front and this is the back. This is the part that goes down into our spinal cord. And there's a go system in the brain, and dopamine, which is a neurochemical that you've probably heard of, is one of the neurotransmitters involved in this go system of the brain that's involved in detection and approach to rewards. And so these rewards could be, you know, tasty food or water if you're thirsty, but also um, positive social interactions, unexpected compliments, or romantic encounters. Maybe it's things like achieving safety after a threatening situation, or even a job well done, like getting an A. So this system, this go system, really recognizes when those rewards are available and drives us to go achieve them. Mammals also have a stop system. So that's going to be in the front of the brain, what we call the prefrontal cortex. It's what I like to call the brain's executive control. It helps moderate the go system so that you don't always want to go. Just because you see a reward doesn't mean it's appropriate or even advantageous to go get it right then. So this part of the brain can weigh cost versus benefits or risk versus reward. Maybe it's telling you to wait for something better later on, or it might consider other people or other plans and goal setting. So this part of the brain really gives context and moderates the go system. And they're in balance when we make decisions and decide what to do. Okay, so what does all of this have to do with alcohol? Well, alcohol is a drug. It's acting pharmacologically on the brain, and it's encoded in the brain as a reward because it's activating that go system in the brain. In fact, alcohol and other addictive drugs, while they're very different types of drugs. They have different targets in the brain. You know, alcohol works differently than stimulants like amphetamines or cocaine, which works differently from opiates like morphine or heroin, which works differently from nicotine. But one common way that they all affect the brain is to enhance activity in the go system of the brain. And another thing they seem to have in common is to reduce the effectiveness of the stop system of the brain. And so when these drugs are on board, you have this situation where the go system is much more prominent than the stop system. Now, also, I want to remind you what I said at the very beginning. This go system is not only detecting rewards, but also all of the context and environment that's associated with the reward. So what is the brain doing when someone drinks alcohol? Well, alcohol pharmacologically can trigger dopamine release and activate the go system. And also the brain is learning about the cues that are associated with alcohol. And these cues over time can also trigger dopamine release because they're signaling to the brain alcohol is available in this context. And that activation of the go system, because it's so tied to our motor system and our movement, also can even promote alcohol seeking behavior or the expectation of drinking. So this is you might be asking, is this addiction? And I would say this is not addiction per se, because this is a normal process that rewards tap into, and it's just alcohol is activating it pharmacologically. I think it's involved in addiction, and so it's in part of the process of addiction for those people who engage in excessive alcohol drinking and problematic alcohol drinking and other drug use. But it's not addiction by itself. Like I said, this is the normal brain process that is associated with detecting and achieving things that the brain thinks are important. But I think that it's really a critical piece of information that people who drink alcohol should know. Because if, say, I work a lot with college students. So say a college student has a big exam coming up, but they want to go out with their friends the night before. And they decide, okay, I'm just going to go out and have one beer, and then I'm going to go home and study. Well, they need to know that the one beer is going to make them biologically want to drink more. And that's important information to know going into it, because then you can have strategies and you can plan for that, and think about other ways that you can moderate your drinking instead of just being blindsided and suddenly you find yourself drinking 3 or 4 beers and then you can't study. You don't go home and you don't study for your test. So this is the first point that I think is just really useful to know, that alcohol pharmacologically triggers this positive reinforcement and a feedback loop that makes you want to drink more. Now I'm going to talk about the teenage brain and how the younger brain is different, and how alcohol actions on the teenage and young adult brain is different than it will be when their brains are older in adulthood. So let's go back to our stop and go systems. In the teenage or young adult brain, and what I'm talking about is up to the mid-20s, the stop and go systems are fully intact. They're there. The brain, the parts of the brain are completely developed. And in fact, the younger brain is really good at learning. It's resilient and adaptive and what we call plastic, which means it can make connections really quickly. So in many ways, it's wired for learning, and it's a great time for youth to be students, because learning and being a student, being in school is easier than it would be at other points of development. But the brain still is developing into the mid-20s. And so what's still developing? Well, the brain generally develops from the bottom up and from the back forward. And the bottom up, it it starts with those brain systems that are really important for, keeping our bodies alive, like breathing and your heart rate and things like that, balance. And back forward, it's starting with those parts of this part of the brain is called the cortex, and it's those parts of the brain that are involved in sensation and perception. And so the sensation like vision and hearing will develop first, but then that higher function of executive control will develop the last. So in fact, the last part of the brain to develop is going to be the stop system. Now, as I said, the stop system is intact in the teenage and young adult brain. It's there. But under situations, what we might call hot situations, where there's a lot of emotion, or there's, maybe there's a lot of peer pressure, or there's a lot of excitement, then the stop system is less effective to communicate with the go system and moderate our behaviors. And so, especially in those emotional or hot situations, the younger brain is very go dominant. Now, how does this play out? This, in fact, is why we have these different characteristics that we associate with being a teenager. Characteristics like a disregard for negative consequences, or being very sensitive to positive consequences and rewards. And while there's a lot of individual differences among people for traits like risk-taking behavior, sensation-seeking, or novelty-seeking, adolescence is that period of life where there's more of those traits compared to younger or older ages. And there's also this increased importance in social context and in peers, and in peer pressure. Well, what's interesting is that these features are not just human features, but in fact they're mammalian features, because we see all of those characteristics in other mammals, even rats and mice, like I study in my lab, even down to the increased importance of peers. And so I want to just make the point that this aspect of brain development is adaptive, it's good, it's normal, because it's during adolescence and young adulthood when mammals need to leave the nest. They need to leave their parents and go out on their own, establish their territory, and individualize. And so that's a scary process. And you need to be less, you need to disregard the potential negative consequences. You need to be risk-taking. You need to, have that drive to go out and explore. But this is also, of course, in humans, when most people who do use drugs or alcohol start experimenting drugs and alcohol. So that's the flip side of these characteristics. And in fact, we see that in national statistics. So this is a slide from the National Institutes of Health, particularly the National Institute on Drug Abuse, looking at a national survey that's been going on for many years called Monitoring the Future. And we see the percent of youth that have reported using alcohol in the past year in 2010, in 2015, and in 2020. And in blue, it's the percent of 8th graders, and in red, 10th graders, and in purple, 12th graders. So you can see that if we look across 10 years, the numbers have gone down, which is great, but there is something of a plateau. So 20% of 8th graders, which would be 14-year-olds, have reported using alcohol in the past year, up to 55% of high school students. And what I'm particularly concerned about as a researcher and as a parent is binge drinking. Binge drinking in this case is defined as consuming 5 or more alcoholic drinks in a session. And these are students who reported doing that in the past 2 weeks. So this would be current binge drinking. And you can see that almost 5% of eighth graders have reported binge drinking in the last 2 weeks, 10% of 10th graders and 17% of 12th graders. So this is something that we know. When adolescents drink alcohol, they tend to binge drink. And I'm going to talk a little bit today about why that is. But this is an important health concern because also what I'll tell you about is that binge drinking is particularly harmful to the brain. Okay, so when we think about the response of an individual, and particularly the brain, to alcohol, how is the teenage or young adult brain response different? Well, there's, and I'll be going into more of these throughout the talk, but the teenage brain is more sensitive to alcohol reward, and that's a reflection of that enhanced activity of the Go system. And so they're not just sensitive to alcohol reward, they're sensitive to other rewards too. But particularly to alcohol, the teenage and young adult brain is more sensitive to alcohol-induced memory disruptions and less sensitive to alcohol sedation. And let me spend a second on that. Well, first, so if you think about these things in, together, increased sensitivity to reward, reduction in memory, and decreased sensitivity, increased sensitivity to the memory impairment, and then decreased sensitivity to alcohol sedation. What happens when a teenager drinks a lot of alcohol? You call it a party. They're very activated. It's almost always in a social context, and they can keep going. And of course, since alcohol pharmacologically makes you want to drink more, they can continue to drink. Whereas an adult who drinks a lot of alcohol, the response is to become sedated and fall asleep. This response, that alcohol sedation, is rate limiting. It's protective. You stop drinking when you become severely sedated or fall asleep. And so the fact that adolescents and young adults are less sensitive to that protective response means that they're more likely to binge drink when they do drink. And again, this is biological. This is not a human thing. It's rather a mammalian thing because it has to do with the developmental stage of the brain. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit now about and give you some examples of how the teenage and young adult brain is differently affected by alcohol. And I'm going to focus on memory because learning and memory is really the job of students. And so when we think about student success and then, something that will impair learning and memory is really, important to consider. And I'm going to start with a study that was done at Duke University. And it was a study that I find really fascinating. So in this study, they brought in 20-year-olds and either early 20s or later 20s. So comparing 21 to 24-year-olds to 25 to 29-year-olds. And they gave everybody either alcoholic drinks or a placebo that brought, for the alcoholic drink, brought their breath alcohol concentrations just up to the legal driving limit. And then as the breath alcohol concentration started to fall off, they did a memory test. And this memory test is what's called a spatial memory test, where you might see an object that has no, obvious meaning, but has a lot of features, and you're told, okay, you've got 30 seconds to memorize as many features of this object as you can. And so you think about, okay, there's this asterisk or this lollipop or this arrow, there's squares, and then the object is taken away and you're distracted by, say, math problems, and you have to do these math problems, and then after a period of time, the investigators ask you, okay, how many features of that object do you remember? You can say, okay, I remember the asterisk and the lollipop and the wavy line and the squares. And so you count up how many of those features you remember. And what the researchers found is that the early or late 20-year-olds did not, were exactly the same on how many features they remembered under the placebo conditions, without alcohol on board. But when alcohol was on board, and this is just under the legal driving limit, the 25 to 29-year-olds were pretty much unaffected for this recall or this memory recall, whereas the early 20-year-old group only remembered about half as many items as the older 20-year-olds. So when I saw these data, I was really surprised because I didn't expect such a big difference within that relatively narrow range of age of 20-year-olds. But I think what it reflects is the fact that the brain is really different. During adolescence, it's still developing, and those parts of the brain that are important in attention and in memory and in learning, the executive control or the go-stop system, as well as memory systems like the hippocampus, there are still some important changes that are occurring before they arrive in full adulthood. And so that's what's reflected here. Alcohol is acting differently in the early 20-year-olds from the later 20-year-olds. Okay, again, this is biological, and we know this because we can see the same things in other animals. And so you can't ask a rat how, many items it remembers, but what you can do is ask it to find a hidden platform in a water maze. So this is representing a big pool of water, and rats, like many mammals, are good swimmers, but they don't particularly care for it. So they're very motivated to find this platform that's just under the surface of the water and they can't see it. But once they find it, it's safety, it's a reward, and their brains, remember all of those things like features in the room, like maybe a clock or a picture or the experimenter standing there. And so that next time you put them in the pool of water, they can swim much more directly to that platform. So this is something that they're motivated to learn where the platform is. It's also spatial learning. So when, again, this is a study from Scott Schwarzwelder's lab at Duke. They found that that when they compared adolescent and adult rats in this task, both ages of animals learned this task pretty quickly. And if anything, the adolescent animals were faster at learning it, as adolescents can learn things faster than adults in many situations. But then they gave animals one of two doses of alcohol. So, it's always a little difficult to compare doses directly between humans and animals, but these are going to be moderate doses of alcohol. And what you see is that the adult rats are not significantly affected by these doses of alcohol. They still can learn the task pretty well. Maybe they start to be affected at the higher dose of alcohol, but the adolescent rats are affected by both of these doses of alcohol. They both really slow how quickly the animals can learn this. Again, there's this sensitivity of the adolescent and young adult brain to the effects of alcohol on memory systems. So one of the things that I'm really interested in is whether some of these effects might be persistent. So is Scott Schwarzwalder at Duke, and his lab tested this by giving animals alcohol or placebo for a period of time. So we're not talking about one dose of alcohol now, we're talking about several binge doses of alcohol, either during adolescent, shown here, or during adulthood, shown here. And then after a month, testing the rats in this learning and memory test. And the adults performed the same, whether or not they had a previous history of binge alcohol. But the adolescents, but the adult rats who, when they were adolescents, had the alcohol exposure, they were slower to learn this task. So there's some evidence from the animal literature and from this, from our basic science literature, suggesting that binge levels of alcohol during adolescence can change the development of the brain. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the talk. Okay, whereas we're talking today about alcohol, I did want to bring a little bit in on marijuana and cannabis, because use of this drug is rising across our country as it's being decriminalized in different states. And I just want to point out that I feel like as the scientific community, we know less about the biological effects, the neuroscience on marijuana or cannabis or THC. And that's because, until recently, there were many restrictions on that kind of research compared to something like alcohol or nicotine that are legal drugs. So another difference is that cannabis today is very different than the cannabis of 20 or 30 years ago. It's genetically engineered or bred, and it's a lot stronger today than it was before. And there's some synthetic cannabinoids on the that people get a hold of as well. And finally, it's difficult to disentangle, when you're just looking at the effects of cannabis use in people, it's difficult to disentangle what factors might lead someone to use cannabis as opposed to the consequences of cannabis use. And so that's, of course, where I think that that science, especially animal models, can be very helpful. But because we can give the animals the drug, in this case cannabis, and see what the consequences are, and we know that it's separated from any predisposing personality traits that might lead someone to use cannabis more in the first place. So if we look at that same spatial learning task, that swimming in the water maze, this is another study from Scott Schwarzwalder's lab, where they trained the animals over 5 days to do this task, and you can really see how the adult animals got better at this task over the 5 days. Adult animals given THC before each training session did worse at the beginning, but eventually they were able to learn it to the same level as the control animals. So THC had an effect, but it wasn't a long-lasting effect. In contrast, when they gave THC to adolescent animals, the control animals learned the task very easily and typically, but then the adolescent animals given THC before every session, in fact, had a much, learned it slower and never quite reached the same level as the controls or as the adults. So there you see that the effects of THC on learning, this type of learning and memory, are also more pronounced in adolescent and young adults. And then this is an example of a human study that I found really compelling. Because again, you know, with people, well, first you can't give, you know, it's not ethical to give people cannabis, especially minors, right? And then if you just study people who are voluntarily using, you never know whether they, you know, there might be something different about them that made them choose to use cannabis as opposed to their peers who aren't using cannabis. But in this study, what they did is they recruited 16 to 25-year-olds who were already cannabis users. So everybody had already chosen to be using cannabis regularly, at least weekly. And then they took half of them and asked them to be abstinent for 4 weeks, and half of them, they said, continue using your regular way. And they looked to see if the abstinence from cannabis would affect their performance. And because attention is something that that's of course involved in all of these tasks. If you're not paying attention, you're not going to remember things. They also measured attention, and attention was not affected. So what you have here are the abstinent group in the circles, and the group they called monitoring control, so the people who continue to use cannabis, in the squares. And you can see that they're very similar. You know, they all got better on this attention task because of practice, but there was no difference between the two groups. In contrast, they tested their memory, and this was declarative memory, so the kind of remembering new information that you learn. And what they found is that at the time zero, when everybody was still using, there was no difference between the groups. But then when people were asked to be abstinent, within a week, their performance and their memory improved and stayed improved for the 4 weeks of abstinence, whereas the group that continued using cannabis didn't improve in their memory. So this was not a task that you get better with over time. And I was really impressed with this immediate and sustained difference between the groups, suggesting that regular cannabis use is impacting these brain systems that are important for learning and memory. Okay, so again, what's a student's job? It's to learn things and remember them so that you can use the information either on a test or in real life. And so the fact that alcohol and marijuana disrupt this learning and memory is important. I'm not going to really go into it, but except that I want to give a little context, because you may be thinking, well, these effects on memory, most of the effects that I've shown you are acute, and nobody's going to, you know, go out drinking and then take it, you know, study for a test right then, right? So what if they're separated in time? But, you know, some of these effects of the drugs on these brain systems and on these processes, learning and memory processes, are persistent. And I showed you the effect of in the animal study where the adolescent rats were given binge levels of alcohol, you know, repeatedly, and had memory impairments in adulthood. And also the cannabis study where people were asked to abstain and their memory improved. So, so there are some persistent effects, but I'd also like to point out that there's another mechanism by which these drugs can disrupt learning, and that's through sleep. And we all know that, you know, as a society, we know that sleep's important. We know that we should get 8 hours of sleep, but some people don't. And we know that it's important for students to get a lot of sleep. And one reason that it's important, because besides our general health, is that sleep is is a time in which memory is what we call consolidated, where if you've spent your day learning some new things, it's really stamped into the brain while you're sleeping. This is one of the roles of sleep in our health. And alcohol and marijuana can disrupt sleep. So not only are they disrupting memory formation by activating, acting on those brain regions that are important for learning and memory, but they're disrupting memory processes by impacting sleep. And so there's two ways uh, um, in which alcohol can disrupt memory. Okay, I'm going to transition now into my third point, which is that there's something special about binge drinking, and it's not special in a good way. It's a particularly harmful pattern of drinking, and it can be associated with blackouts. Okay, so just a reminder, what is binge drinking? Well, binge drinking is often defined as 5 drinks in a session for men or 4 drinks in a session for women. I showed you the data, the survey data from Monitoring the Future that showed that 4.5% of 8th graders are already binge drinking. That actually in 2020, there was not a sex difference in that, so it was similar numbers for male and female students. Although there can be more sex differences going up, but my point means that that's a big binge for the female students, also because for younger individuals, so teenagers, we think that fewer drinks are required to get the blood alcohol concentrations to these binge levels. And also smaller individuals, of course, might not need as many standard drinks to reach these high BACs or blood alcohol concentrations that are associated with binge drinking. So really, I like to think about binge drinking as a drinking pattern that produces high levels of alcohol in the blood. And what kind of things can influence this? Well, your body weight can influence it. If you're a smaller person, 5 drinks is going to produce higher blood alcohol concentrations than if you're a larger person drinking 5 drinks. Also, we know there are sex differences. So women can reach those concentrations with fewer drinks than men, and part of that is body weight, and part of that are other things like body composition. Food intake can really affect the blood alcohol concentrations, because it can either, if you eat food with alcohol, then you're slowing the absorption of the alcohol. So you're slowing that peak, and you have lower overall, lower peak blood alcohol concentrations than if you drink without any food. But also the speed of drinking is important. So taking those 5 drinks as shots, right in a row, is going to produce much higher blood concentrations than if you drink 5 beers over 5 hours. So all of these things can influence, and I think we need to really focus on the concentrations of alcohol in the blood that are associated with binge drinking. So if we go back to how we know that the teenage or young adult brain reacts differently to these high doses of alcohol. More reward, so the makes them want to drink more. More sensitivity to alcohol memory disruption, and then less sensitivity to the alcohol sedation. So they don't have that rate limiting or protective factor. You kind of have a perfect storm of that can lead to a blackout. So teens and young adults, when they binge drink, are more likely to experience blackouts. And this is a combination of drinking more, the sensitivity to memory disruption, and the lack of sedation that allows them to continue to move around and do things while they're highly intoxicated. So this is a study from Aaron White at the National Institute of Health, who who has done a lot of research studying blackouts. And in this study, they've interviewed people who experienced blackouts and found out, because of course they don't remember doing these things, they found out what they did during their blackout. And so, and you can see that there's things like insulting someone or getting in a fight, spending more money than they intended to, engaging in sexual activity, and it may be unprotected or unwanted sexual activity. There's vandalizing property, although there's a big sex difference in this one, that for some reason that property vandalism was carried out by males much more often than females. And then, of course, driving a car, or when impaired. So what I'd like you to think about is that these activities are usually highly memorable. When we have a fight, that's emotional. That's, we usually remember that. Or when we engage in sexual activity, that's something that's highly memorable. So this is not like losing your car keys, and you can't remember where you put your car keys, or you misplaced something. No, this is losing the memory of a highly memorable event. And so I'd like you to think about what other kinds of things can cause this kind of memory loss. What would cause this kind of memory loss? Well, there's, neurological diseases like Alzheimer's disease or dementia. There's injuries like, a severe concussion or a traumatic brain injury, or even a stroke. Those kinds of traumatic events can cause this kind of memory loss. And so I would like you to think about blackouts as being a neurological trauma as well. It's an event that that really impacts the normal function of the brain. And especially on college campuses, it seems like there is a culture of around some groups where, people voluntarily, they plan to drink to blackout. They joke about it. It's a funny thing. It's something that they talk about. But who would sign up to get, concussions once a month? Who would sign up to say, oh, hit me on the head so that I can't remember anything, and that's how I'm going to go out and have a good time, right? So one of the things that I think that I would like to see happen in our society, and especially on our college campuses, is to change the culture around blackouts so that it's not something that's this, a topic of a comedy movie, but rather it's a warning sign, and it's a sign of, that where we need to intervene, and it's a sign of neurological trauma. And in fact, there's lots of studies, and this comes from one study showing, just looking at the link between blackouts and other risk factors that lead to blackouts, and also the consequences of blackouts. And in this study, they surveyed young adults who were 1 year past high school. And so it would be kind of college freshman age, although not all the participants were in college. And first, blackouts are common in this age group. So 20% of those who were drinkers had reported a blackout in the last 6 months. Risk factors that were associated with blackouts are going to be things like being female. Now we know that females will have higher blood alcohol levels at, binge levels of drinking. And also people who used other drugs, or people who got drunk, and people who had lower body weight. So these are all associated with higher blood alcohol concentrations, but also people who live in dorms, which shows that there's a context associated with it too. If you're in a place where your peers are drinking a lot, then you may be more likely to drink a lot and then experience a blackout. This is something that I'm particularly interested in, is that after controlling for drinking levels. And so what that means is that you might have someone who drinks 7 drinks, and but they're drinking 1 drink a day. And so over the week they have 7 drinks, but it's 1 drink a day. Their blood alcohol concentrations are never going to go very high, versus someone who drinks 7 drinks in a week, but it's all in one session. Then they can have very high blood alcohol concentrations. And so that's what you mean by after controlling for drinking levels. Blackouts were the strongest predictor of most other alcohol-related problems, including, problems with school or with work, as well as legal issues, DUIs, or getting into, getting arrested, or misdemeanors, getting into fights, and even overdosing. So to me, this says that blackouts are actually a signal of more severe alcohol-associated problems, and should be a time for us to intervene if one of our peers or our family members or community members is experiencing blackouts. Okay, and then I want to talk just a little bit about how these binge levels of alcohol can affect brain development. And in fact, this is one of the things that I study as a scientist. So this actually is not one of my studies, but this is by Bonnie Nagel, who's a neuroscientist who studies youth and the transition into drinking behavior. And she uses brain imaging. So this is a study where the subjects, the individuals, had their brains imaged in an MRI scanner. And when you do a task in a scanner, you can see that, by changes in the image, how, which brain systems are active or not active, during a particular task. And in this task, she had the students do a kind of a risky, safe choice behavior, where they had to, they took some risk taking, and then, kind of, to get a reward versus, playing it safe. And you see activation in particular parts of the brain that we know are involved in this kind of decision making. And right now, the first time that she looked at their brains during this task, there was no difference between the groups, because nobody, was just recruiting teenagers of a certain age, and none of them had started drinking yet. Now, when she brought them back into the lab, some of them had started binge drinking. And those that were now binge drinking had lost that brain activity. They're doing the task, but they're not showing the typical brain activity associated with that task. Whereas their peers who had not started binge drinking looked very, the same as the earlier brain scan. Now, when she looked further at the individuals and their individual drinking versus, which is on here, versus their individual brain response here, she saw that the more someone had consumed alcohol during the past 3 months, the more drinking days they reported, the lower their brain response. And so this was kind of dose dependent. A dose-dependent reduction in brain activity during a decision-making task associated with the drinking. Now, in the Bowles Center for Alcohol Studies at UNC, my lab and other labs are really interested in this question of how that adolescent or underage drinking can impact decision making and other biological endpoints both immediately, but also later on in adulthood. And I think this is a really important question because a lot of youth drink alcohol, and a lot of those who drink will binge drink. But many people stop drinking. They kind of age out of it as they get responsibilities, as they, have decide to, do other things with their life. Maybe they get married, they get a job, they find their careers. They naturally reduce their drinking. And of course, their brains are maturing and the response to alcohol changes. So binge drinking doesn't mean you're addicted. But I'm interested in whether that binge drinking during the adolescent period can have long-term consequences that may impact someone's success in life. And so I study this with animals in my lab because I can, again, give them that binge exposure to alcohol during the adolescent period, and then they can then stop the alcohol, let them grow up into adulthood, and test whether any of the brain systems that we know are developing during adolescence have been impacted by that alcohol exposure. And what we find is that, so in my lab, I've seen an increased sensitivity to reward cues after adolescent alcohol exposure, suggesting that that adolescent sensitivity to rewards might be extended into adulthood. And my colleague has found some similar evidence in people. I've also found that the connections or the interactions between the stop system and the go system were reduced after adolescent alcohol exposure. And my colleague has seen similar things in people that are associated with reported binge drinking during adolescence. Other labs, like Fulton Cruz Lab and the Alcohol Center, have seen changes in neuroimmune signaling or the response to challenges like immune challenges or other kind of pathogens in the brain. And they've seen this reduced response or increased neuroimmune signaling after adolescent alcohol exposure in rats. And then they found similar effects looking at post-mortem brain tissue from people who had alcohol use disorder, suggesting that it might also happen in people. Other labs have seen change, less of the beneficial growth factors or these chemicals in the brain that are really important for the health of brain cells and neurons. And there's also fewer cholinergic cells. Now, cholinergic cells are interesting because they're important for learning and memory and attention. So that's acetylcholine is a neurochemical that's really important in the stop system. And if there's less of this neurochemical, that's also could be why that there's some less connectivity or less effectiveness of the stop system and the go system. So there do appear to be some long-lasting effects that are at least possible after adolescent alcohol exposure that may be happening in people who engage in binge drinking during the adolescent and young adult period. But the good news is that we can also look at interventions or things that can improve brain health. And I'm particularly interested about some studies from Fulton Cruz's lab that showed that the combination of abstinence and exercise can reverse or prevent some of these effects that we're seeing in the brain. And so that's very exciting to me. So, so far, I've shown you that alcohol can activate the go system and kind of impair the stop system, and a pharmacological effect of alcohol is to make you want to drink more. So you need to be aware of that when you're planning your drinking. Teens and young adults up into their mid-20s are more vulnerable to drug use and consequences for a variety of reasons, and they're also more vulnerable to memory disruption effect of these drugs. And then binge patterns of drinking are especially harmful. First, they can lead to blackouts, which are a traumatic brain event, but also they can lead to persistent changes in brain and behavior that then might affect, decision making and other function, other health issues across the lifespan. And I'd like to wrap up by just going over a little bit about how alcohol can affect so many aspects of our brains and our behavior in ways that can really impact student success. And to do this, I'm going to use an infographic from Talk It Out that that I and other scientists helped to develop. And it's showing in very general terms, these different areas of the brain that have different functions. And some of these we've already talked about, but alcohol affects all of these areas of the brain. So one of them shown here is impulse control. That would be the go system that I've talked about today. And alcohol, as I've told you, can really shift decision making to where the go system is really in charge, and the stop system or judgment is less effective to moderate impulse control. So you have a lot more impulsive behavior, and this can affect how how we handle or react to emotions or stress, and it can also result in risky behaviors that you might not undertake if alcohol weren't on board. The stop system, or the prefrontal cortex, is important in judgment and in executive control. It's kind of the control center of the brain. And I've told you how alcohol and other drugs can really impact the effectiveness of that part of the brain to control our behavior. And it is not, you can also see how alcohol use, and especially binge drinking, if it's impacting this part of the brain, it's going to impact so many aspects of success in school and in our jobs. And so for students, this really can negatively impact both the ability to do schoolwork, but also the part that's so important of planning and maintaining a balance and being able to think ahead. The hippocampus, which is an area of the brain kind of here, is one of the main systems important in the learning and memory that I've talked about today. And it talks to the prefrontal cortex as well, or that stop system, the executive control. But it's another area that seems really sensitive to alcohol, as demonstrated. And so, as I told you, it's easy to see how that can impact students' performance in class, being able to learn new material and then remember it and integrate it like you do when you're a student. Now, I didn't talk too much about consciousness or some of the other areas of the cortex that are involved in, say, language, that are also involved in memory. This part of the brain is also important in that sedative effects of alcohol, part of the signals that can tell you when you've had a lot of alcohol, the feelings of being intoxicated. And so if youth are less sensitive to those things, then they don't have that feedback that helps them to reduce their drinking. The cerebellum is really important for coordination, and alcohol effects on the cerebellum can really contribute to accidents and emergency room visits, as well as other parts like part of the sedative effects of alcohol. But this part of the brain is really sensitive to repeated binge drinking, and in adults with alcohol use disorder, there are often pathologies. There's often problems with this part of the brain. And in some youth, you know, who are heavy binge drinking youth, you can even see that. And so this is something to, you know, this is something that's really important. And it can also, it's important for athletic performance. And so if a student athlete, you know, may not want to, you know, rethink drinking, knowing that alcohol effects on the parts of the brain that they're relying on for their peak athletic performance are being affected by alcohol. And then finally, these lower brain systems that are so critical for keeping us alive can be affected by alcohol, and particularly these high doses of alcohol. And when you hear about alcohol toxicity and alcohol, you know, and death due to alcohol overdose, it's if alcohol effects on these brain regions. So I'm going to close by showing you these resources that you can use to find out more information. A white paper that I know that Jim Van Heck talked about last week in the Talk It Out series that talks more about adolescent brain development and the impact of alcohol on that. Some government resources, the Talk It Out website, facts about underage drinking from the National Institutes of Health, and research on both adolescent drinking in people at this first link and in animals at this second link. And I think we're going to be putting these resources into the chat so that you can click on them if you want to explore any of them. And with that, I'm going to now turn it over to the other presenters. Stop sharing. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson, very much. We have two responders to Dr. Robinson. One is Bethany Men, who is the Vice President of Student Affairs for the UNC system. She is the liaison to 17 constituent institutions of the UNC system and dealing with policy in a whole bunch of areas, including student health. So she's very interested in and has been a leader in the talk about what we can do for student success, particularly on the collegiate level. The second presenter is Donita Robinson, who is a licensed substance use counselor in Morganton, North Carolina. She works for Burke Recovery and is in the school system in Burke Public Schools, so she can bring a perspective of how alcohol affects secondary education students. And she's an old friend of mine. We work together in Morganton, so I'm glad she's with us today. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Men, please. Bethany. She's there, but you need. I can't hear her either. Bethany, can you unmute your computer?
Is that better? Can you hear me now? You can hear me now? Oh, thank you, Dr. Robinson. All right, let's see if I can share my screen. All right, here we go. All right, can you see my screen now? I can't see anybody. I'm hoping you can see my screen. Okay.
Yes, although it's not on a presenter,
Okay. How about that?
Perfect. It's good.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. Appreciate. I was just going to say it's so hard to follow Dr. Robinson after that great presentation, and then I can't even figure out how to get myself off mute. So please have a little grace with me this morning. It's hard to follow that great work that Dr. Robinson just talked about and all of the amazing research she's doing. I appreciate listening to that and having the opportunity to respond this morning. As Dr. Van Hecke shared, I'm Bethany Min, the Vice President for Student Affairs at the University of North Carolina System. I'm very excited to be here this morning. I'd like to give you just a little bit of background about the University of North Carolina System before I do a couple responses about student success. One is just want to give you a context about who the system is, and two, any opportunity I can get to brag on the wonderful faculty, staff, and students that make up the UNC system. I want to take advantage of that opportunity. So the UNC system is made up of the 16 public four-year universities in the North Carolina, and you'll see most of them on the screen, plus the one residential high school for the students of science and math. We have a campus in Durham, and we'll be opening another campus in a year in Morganton. We have over 240,000 students enrolled all across the state. And this year alone, over 55,000 students are graduating. And so many of those students stay in the state and are doing lots of great work. And so we're excited about how we are involved in the community. And one of the things I did want to brag on this morning is one of the great things the system has been involved in is the community vaccine clinics. 9 of our universities are doing clinics to help get North Carolinians vaccinated. Here's a picture of UNC Pembroke. This is their mobile unit. They are going around to assisted living facilities and helping elderly get vaccinated. They're also working with the Lumbee tribe to get them vaccinated. So very excited how our universities are helping their campuses. UNC Greensboro opened their clinic last week. 2 weeks ago, I was able to visit A&T and see the wonderful clinic they have going there, a lot of Aggie pride. So just so excited that we're able to partner with the Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Emergency Management to vaccinate folks. So just wanted to share that tidbit about something great that's going on across the system. So when Mr. Van Hecke asked me to talk about our student services, wanted to stress that the student services that we provide here really are wraparound services. And we're doing this because we know that they contribute to academic success. So much like providing tutoring, much like providing a writing center, we want to provide all of these other services to support prevention, identifying students that are in substance abuse and helping them recover. And so I'm going to talk a little bit first about our wellness and prevention services. And it really goes back to what Dr. Robinson was saying, this culture of blackout drinking, right? We do see that on our college campuses, unfortunately. And so our wellness and prevention services really help students think about healthy habits they can develop. And it's not just around drinking. Dr. Robinson also mentioned sleep. Gosh, college kids do not sleep, friends. If you know any college student, they don't sleep. They live on those little drinks, those energy drinks, which are so bad for them. And so we have wellness and prevention services on our campuses to talk with them about how do you develop healthy habits? Because we know if we can get them to develop these healthy habits when they're in this 18 to 24 range, what great lives that they will have being able to take those away with them from college, right? It's better to learn these habits now than try to pick them up later and to ingrain them into everything that you do. So many of our campuses have wellness and prevention services that, like I shared, help students talk about how do we have healthy lifestyles. Also want to highlight our Dean of Students office. Our Dean of Students help students that have been identified that perhaps are having a substance use problem. Our Deans of Students help them get connected with case managers. Our case managers can help them provide a number of resources. Our Dean of Students office also works on our student conduct side. And so many times if a student is caught with alcohol, Dr. Robinson mentioned in the residence halls, right? So there is an educational component to that, right? If you're caught for that, you do get a sanction. And we often have students do some online modules that talk about many of the things that she just discussed, how alcohol affects your brain development, how it affects your academic success. And so really working with students there to understand the long-term consequences. Because just telling a student you shouldn't be drinking is not an effective prevention strategy, right? Instead, they've got to see the big picture. And Dr. Robinson did a great job painting that big picture for us. I'm sorry, I have some childcare issues, so my toddler's right here. So I'm just going to keep talking louder, pretend he's not standing here. All right, counseling and student health services. This is another great way that we are supporting students that are having difficulties, whether it be, mental health challenges, substance use challenges. All of our institutions have counseling centers and student health service centers. And very proud to say that if you look at the bottom of the screen, you will see on the bottom the logo for Protocol. That is a 24-hour counseling service. All UNC system schools have been able to utilize this. The UNC system has paid for this contract. So what's great is on a Friday night at 8, if a student is having, if they're stressed out, they're anxious, a lot of things are going on, they call the counseling center number, and they can get connected to a counselor 24/7. And they don't even realize they're not talking to a counselor on the campus. The folks at Protocol are trained so well that they sound just like they're on campus. For instance, they'll ask the student, hey, what residence hall do you live in? And the student could say, oh, I live in Belk Hall. And they're like, did you know that Belk is just across from the fitness center? Sometimes when you're dealing with stress, it's good to go take a walk. Why don't you go walk around the track? Or if the student is in great distress, then the counselor on the line would call the campus police, and the campus police can come over and help get that person connected to an emergency room or a psychiatrist. So we're so thankful that we have Protocol across the system. Our student health services are also another great partner for us in providing care for our students that need it. We're so thankful for the good work they do. And lastly, I want to highlight our collegiate recovery communities. We have 11 collegiate recovery communities across the UNC system, many thanks to the Department of Health and Human Services for a block grant we get. And so in these collegiate recovery communities, they help provide students that are in recovery support. So on the screen, I also put something about the Butterfly Fair and the Uncg Spartan Recovery Program. So these programs help students navigate stressful times in college. When you think about spring break, right? And I'm sure Dr. Robinson mentioned there's some blackout drinking going on in spring break, unfortunately. So, with Spartan Recovery, they do an alternative spring break where they take kids in recovery to a safe space, right? And they do counseling and therapy, but they also still have fun like college students should and enjoy that spring break. So excited that we have all of these tools. And just to go back to what I started with, the reason we have these is these are just as important to us to student success as, like I shared, the tutoring center, the writing center, office hours with your faculty member. We know that a lot of life happens outside of the classroom for our students, and we want to help provide them all the resources we can to make sure that they're successful in our classes, so that they graduate and that they develop healthy life skills, so that when they move on from our campuses, they can contribute to North Carolina and they can be great members of their community. So I appreciate your patience while I had myself on mute, and I have a toddler who wanted to participate. Just want to thank you all for the opportunity to respond to Dr. Robinson. Many thanks to Jim Van Hecke for inviting me. He'll probably never invite me again, but that's okay. I appreciated this opportunity. And Preston, thank you for all the help with the technology. And if you have any questions or would like to have any more information about our wonderful CRCs or any of the great work we're doing, please don't hesitate to reach out. Any opportunity I get to brag on the great work that's happening on our campuses, I appreciate. And I just want to stress, it's not just the great work of our faculty and staff that are putting all these resources in place. Our students are doing great work too. It is hard to be a college student right now. It is hard during a pandemic, and they are doing the work too to make good choices about living a healthy lifestyle that will impact their academic success. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you very much. Bethany. I tell you, when I was in school many years ago, we had none of those services that you described. So the university has learned, as we have learned, and progressed in our knowledge of the way things are and what our needs are. And that y'all are just providing just some magnificent services to the students on the campus. And thank you for that. Thank you for your leadership and for being here today, you and your son. Okay, thanks. And now I'd like to hear from Donita Robinson, who I told you earlier is a licensed substance abuse counselor and who works in secondary schools in Burke County, Burke Public Schools. Donita? Donita,
You hear me?
There you go. We need to see you too. So if we can.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. Can you see me?
No.
No? Yes. What about start the video?
Yes.
What about now?
Yes. Hello.
He's not gonna invite me either. Okay. Thank you so much, you guys, for having me. And I just wanted to briefly say is that the presentations was wonderful. I appreciate it for all the information that you have given us. And I wanted to say we all know that alcohol use during adolescence affect educational attainment by decreasing the years of schooling and the likelihood of completing school. So our duties are, especially if you work with the school system, is the push the importance of prevention. It's very important to start early. Starting the conversations regarding alcohol, the dangers of alcohol in adolescence, we need to start that conversation early and often. Starting when a child enters elementary, continuing in middle school, high school, and even college. Now, we know our parents are the leading influence in a child's life on their decisions to drink or not to drink. But unfortunately, some parents are not good role models. So therefore, we need to come in and team up with anyone in the school systems who may have influences on a child's life. Administrators, teachers, guidance counselors, coaches, resource officers, even a custodian. Because you have to think children spend anywhere from 6 to 8 hours a day in school. So these people have influences over children's lives. So we need to team up with them. It takes a village to raise a child. And like Mr. Jim said, I am a certified alcohol and drug counselor. I service 4 high schools, 4 middle schools, and 1 alternative school in my county. My other coworkers, they also do prevention. And what we do sometimes is we team up with the health teachers in the middle schools and high schools, and we do presentations on the dangers of alcohol and other substances in all the health classes. Again, I stress prevention is where it is. I also run a 6-week drug education program for students who violate the drug-free policy in our schools, in middle schools and high schools. And when they violate that policy, what I do is basically screen to see if they're appropriate for my program, because my program is basically education. And unfortunately, some students need more than education. So if that's the case, then we get together and we do the proper referral to get that child the services that they need. So I just wanted to say, just start the conversation. You know, research shows that once the conversations go up, underage drinking goes down. So we must continue to conversate. So I'm challenging you guys to start with your family. Any child in your family, start that conversation. Go in your neighborhoods and your churches, your community, and just start the conversation. It works. We may not see the results quickly because prevention, you know, we have to keep doing it, but it works. Thank you.
Matika, thank you. You
Thank
do
you.
such remarkable work in those schools, and because I remember when I was there with you, the great job you're doing, you're still doing. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think we have some questions. Preston, are you monitoring those?
I am, and Dr. Robinson's done a great job of answering them. So, but I can, if Dr. Robinson, if you want to, I can read them out to you again. I'm not sure if you can see
Sure.
the questions, and we can kind of give those. One question is from Rodney Poole at the ABC Commission. What would less functional connectivity between the prefrontal cortex and the Go system look like in an adolescent or young adult?
Mhm. Yeah, so in an I answered it already in the chat, and I'm going to add to that because the short answer is, it could look like a lot of different things. When you look at what's happening with in an MRI, in a brain image, it's hard to relate exactly how that relates to someone's behavior, or how that's going to manifest, right? But what we think it's reflecting is a lack of that top-down control, or that executive control over the Go system. So it might manifest as making decisions less efficiently, maybe having to use more brain energy or brain circuits to make a decision that with better functional connectivity you could make more efficiently or easily. But it also, when you think about adolescents and young adults in particular, it may mean that that the Go system is more is driving decision making more, and it may make, already during that developmental period, you have less effective top-down control or prefrontal executive control, less effective stop system under those hot situations, of high emotions, peer pressure, or stress. And so you might have those situations more often. It could be that less functional connectivity means that you're even more vulnerable to those disruptions in your decision-making process. So that's an area of active research, but it supports what we do know about how alcohol can affect the interaction of these brain systems.
Awesome. I believe that was the only question we have thus far. Lots of praises to you, Dr. Robinson, as well as Bethany and Matika for your responses. But other than that, I'm not seeing too many more questions, Jim.
Okay, well, thank you, Preston, and thanks again to Donita, if I can be so blunt as to call you all by your first names, to Donita, to Bethany, and to Matika. We are all teachers. We were talking a lot today about student success, but whether we're in the classroom as a teacher, or whether we're in the classroom as a counselor, or whether we are just in the classroom of the community where we can interact with young people, we are all teachers. And so I want to close this session today with a poem for all of us who are teachers. And this poem is called "Blessed Are You Who Bear the Light of Being a Teacher. Blessed are you who bear the light in unbearable times, who testify to its endurance amid the unendurable, who bear witness to its persistence when everything seems in shadow and grief. Blessed are you in whom the light lives, in whom the brightness blazes, your heart a chapel, an altar where in the deepest night can be seen the fire that shines forth in you, in unaccountable faith, in stubborn hope, in love that illumines every broken thing it finds. Blessed are you, teachers, all of us who seek to make a better world and working with young people in high school and in college. So thank you both. Let me just say that next week, we're blessed to have Reverend Dr. Porter Taylor with us. He is a former Episcopal bishop for the Western Diocese in North Carolina. He is now assistant bishop in the state of Virginia, and was an old colleague of mine at UNC. So we look forward to having Porter Taylor with us next week. Until then, have a great rest of the week, and we'll see you next Tuesday. Thanks again, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.